Anyone with even the most cursory knowledge of modern European history knows that the relationship between Russia and the area we now call Germany is one of the most influential in geopolitics. The major flashpoint of Europe, Germany, Russia, and the states in between are where the European peninsula meets the European heartland. While the international context is overwhelmingly different today to 200 years ago, the delicate balance between the two powers remains. Since Russia's relations with the West began to deteriorate in 2014, Germany has needed to weigh precariously its conflicting interests to its east and west. But as is always the case, Russian actions can make maintaining that balance awkward. Recent events, in particular the Novichok poisoning of Alexei Navalny, the protests in Belarus, and the removal of US troops from German bases, have threatened to tip it out of kilter. Always significant, the relationship is experiencing a moment of increased importance. I'm Christian Smith, and today on this free preview of the Club GPF Podcast Plus, we're discussing the future of this relationship with Ekaterina Zolotova and Caroline Rose. Thanks both for your time. Ekaterina, if I can just come to you first, I wonder if you could just set out a bit of a roadmap for us of the history of Russian-German relations since the end of the Cold War until about 2014. Were they good relations? Were they close? What was the basis there?
So the relations between Germany and Russia are closely intertwined during the whole period of the time. And for a long time, the dynamics of their relation remained, I would like to say, key on this European map. Russia and Germany have been allies for some period of time, but there were also some periods when they were enemies, for example, in the World Wars. Russia and Germany have moved closer together since the end of the Cold War. And for the first 2 decades, Germany has become one of the most important trade partner and economic partner of Russia in the world. Not only Russian exports started to grow to Germany, but also a lot of German companies started to enter Russian market. And it was extremely popular to learn German language. I remember that when I was at school, I studied German language for 10 years, but to tell the truth, I can't say many words right now because I didn't practice for a long time. Many Russians started to move to Germany, and they created really large Russian-speaking diaspora in this country. I can say in the center of Europe. So the relations were developing very dynamically, in both in economic sphere and also in social sphere. And you mentioned 2014. It was really a very hard year for the relations between Russia and Germany. But I would say that it was not exactly 2014. It started from 2012. It was the period when the positive dynamics in the relations between Russia and Germany started to change. And the relations itself, they started to become cool. So why it happened in 2012? It was the year when Russia held presidential elections and Putin won. So Russia began to have a very negative image of rather authoritarian state that was unable to build a modern economy, and that is based on exploitation of natural resources, especially oil and gas. In addition, by that time, Russia had already had several conflicts with the post-Soviet countries. For example, Georgia and Ukraine at the time was already shaken. Exactly at that time, in 2012 and 2013, a little bit before the Ukrainian crisis, Moscow started to show the signs that it wants to keep Ukraine under its influence. And of course, Berlin didn't like it. Later in 2014, Ukrainian crisis finally ended this era of close and friendly interaction between Russia and Germany. And Russia and Germany started to be separated. But of course, they still continue to have much in common. Mostly, they still continue to have economic ties. Russia continued to be one of the largest supplier of oil and gas to this country. But of course, their relations are now spoiled by the sanctions.
Caroline, I mean, how much of a breaking point do you think, or 2012 through to 2014 was? Was it a similar sort of breaking point that Russia had with the US at that time, where that from that point it was a bit of a point of no return, or has Germany managed to maintain good relations, well, better relations than the US has?
I think that 2014 certainly caught Germany by surprise to an extent, particularly the conflict in Ukraine over Crimea. That being said, I do think that Germany historically had been caught in a conflict of interest with Russia for decades. And 2014 was a moment where they had to balance that far more carefully because they wanted to be, and were serving at the time, as the primary diplomatic leader of the EU. And so they had this conflict of interest where they had economic needs with Russia, especially as with Russia being one of their most important oil suppliers and gas suppliers and, destination for a lot of their raw materials. But at the same time, they really did not want to try and contradict a lot of the moral and political messaging that the EU required of Germany as one of the leaders of the EU. So, historically, if you look at the German-Russian relationship, Germany has always looked eastward to Russia as the source of raw materials that fueled its industrial machine. Even looking back to like 1939, far before 2014, and far before the Cold War started, Germany needed these raw materials and raw supplies to ensure that its automobile industry was robust, machinery was able to be constructed, and all of its industrial industry. So I think that this is still a trend that we see today, and Germany now has to balance this economic interest with the political interest of keeping, NATO united and keeping Europe as a united front against a potential Russian threat.
Well, yeah, I mean, speaking of Europe, Germany's obviously often considered one of the leading, well, it is one of the leading authorities within the EU, and much of what the EU does is often seen as policy of Germany and France. Yet Germany seems to have this slightly contradictory foreign policy towards Russia that the rest of the EU, in particular France, doesn't share. I mean, how does that play out?
It plays out in a bit of a rivalry, actually, within the EU. And it's really been interesting to see how this has played out over the Navalny poisoning. So, for example, Navalny, he was hospitalized in Germany, and German labs conducted tests to see whether Navalny was poisoned or whether, he was not. And so Germany was at the forefront of a lot of this testing and a lot of the initial care that Navalny received. But, it was France that came out with some of the initial allegations that Navalny was poisoned by either the Russian government or elements or allies of the Russian government. And the same goes with Belarus. French President Macron, he met with Belarusian opposition figures far before the German government did. And in some cases, this does help Germany to an extent. It first, it tries to take off some of the political pressure that would have initially been put on Berlin to meet with a lot of these opposition figures. And, it is ironic because a lot of these opposition figures are fleeing to Germany. They're not fleeing to France, they're not fleeing to, Belgium or any other part of Western Europe. It's mostly Eastern Europe and Germany. So there has been a lot of pressure for Germany to halt some of its economic ties with Russia, most notably, of course, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, or, adopt a more hardline stance diplomatically, politically, and economically against Russia. And Germany has really tried to walk a tightrope with this. And it's really caused a lot of their, political landscape. It's caused some division. Particularly between the social democratic element and the more conservative element of Germany's political class. So, some are arguing that they should adopt a more hardline stance against Russia and either suspend or stall certain parts of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project. And others have argued that, the pipeline project is almost essentially done, and that they should continue with this, and that this should not affect their economic relations with Russia.
Ekaterina, I mean, obviously, let's dig into this question of the Alexei Navalny poisoning. Of course, Alexei Navalny is the probably most prominent opponent to Vladimir Putin in Russia, and he was poisoned, it seems, by Novichok and somewhat seems deliberately by the Russian state while he was in Siberia recently and flown to Germany and has since been recovering. How significant do you think this poisoning is going to be in terms of Russia and German relations? Caroline obviously just set out a few issues going on there, but I mean, it seems like something that might be too minor to have a real destabilizing impact on that relationship. Do you think that's true?
I think that this case was really strange. And all of the situation of poisoning of Russian oppositionist Alexei Navalny and his transportation from Russia to Berlin clinic was also very strange. Whether Germany wanted this or not, it got into this poisoning story, and the Berlin clinic announced this poisoning. So anyhow, it needs to react somehow. Now, before we start to discuss the potential relation and the influence of all of this situation, I would start with the aims of Germany right now. This month, Germany marks a very important date. It's the 30th anniversary since the end of the division of Germany. And we need to understand that right now, Germany is a little bit different country than it was 30 years ago. Earlier, Germany was looking for the ways to keep the unification, to strengthen its security, also including through deeper cooperation with the East, including Russia. Now, the central theme of the foreign policy is creation of the most favorable conditions for German influence in Europe. So, at the same time, the topic of security is no longer discussed, since Russia has ceased to be the source of the threat as the Soviet Union was. And Russia also has ceased itself from the part of the greater Europe, and there are many reasons for this. For example, Russian transformation, the shifts toward Asia, and also difficulties in European integration. So right now we see that that Germany is leaning towards the European Union, and it has this story with Navalny. So, in fact, now we have the forces that are supporting democracy and are against of the Putin regime. And they see this attempt of poisoning as attempt of Russian ruling elite to prolong their presence in the power. Of course, they and Germany take the side of Navalny, and they expect that the German government will certainly punish Russian rulers for that. For example, German foreign minister said that imposing sanctions on Russia is an inevitable step. But the problem right now that Germany has to respond to these external challenges, and it has not to make the other members of European Union discontent with their decisions. So, in my opinion, Germany will impose economic sanctions. Though Germany and Russia, they have economic ties, and German business may feel this pressure. So I think the sanctions will be mostly in political sphere, and they will not touch economy so much because everyone will suffer from this. It's difficult to say who exactly will be under the sanctions and what exactly will be under the sanctions. But anyhow, Germany doesn't want to make Russia very sad, and it doesn't want to spoil the existing relations with Russia. And also, they still remember that Russia remains to be one of the major source of energy to Germany, oil and gas. So the punishment won't be so terrible, in my opinion.
Let's just move on now to a couple of the other prominent issues on the agenda at the moment. U.S. troops in Germany is something that we've talked about on this podcast before, and they've been increasingly being removed from Germany. Caroline, what is the significance of that in terms of Germany's relationship with Russia?
This certainly impacts the German relationship with Russia. So back in July, the United States announced that they were withdrawing 12,000 troops in Germany, meeting a cap of about 24,000 forces in the country. Back in, I believe, the spring, the U.S. initially announced that it was only looking to withdraw about 9,500 troops. And so 12,000 more is a significant uptick. And then on top of that, they said that they would be essentially reallocating the 5,400 of those 12,000 troops to remain in Europe at different posts, for example, in Belgium and Italy and whatnot. On top of that, and I think this is probably one of the more significant elements of this decision, the United States is also looking to move some of their command centers and some of their military headquarters. For example, the European command, they're looking to switch to Belgium. They're reconsidering the location of their Africa command, AFRICOM. And then they're also repositioning about 3 brigade-sized headquarters to Belgium and Italy, and a few squadrons as well. So the interesting thing is that the United States originally said that they were, looking to downsize their footprint in Germany because of, some of the political rifts that they had with Germany. And on top of that, Germany's lack of military spending, not being able to meet the 2% of GDP requirement that NATO has encouraged its members to have. But it certainly indicates that the United States is looking to withdraw overall from Europe and scale down some of its defense commitments. This affects the German relationship with Russia in that it scales down some of the leverage that Berlin was able to wield against Moscow. For example, they have dependency in their economic sectors, especially in the energy sector, because Russia is one of their biggest energy importers. That being said, Germany is going to have less of an American presence that they can use as leverage against Russia in political matters, for example, with the Belarus crisis, and then on top of that, the Navalny poisoning. I also think that this might try and encourage Russian interest in, more investment projects, and it also may encourage Russia to, increase its footprint in Eastern Europe. What we haven't seen so far is an uptick in American presence or NATO presence in Poland. That initially was expected in the U.S. drawdown in Germany, but we haven't seen any kind of decision to make a permanent base in Poland or any other Eastern European country or increase the U.S.'s rotational presence. So I don't necessarily think that this is going to be seen as an open window or an open door for Russia to increase its footprint immediately in the Eastern European periphery. But it certainly, I think, makes Germany reconsider some of its defense options. And on top of that, its relationship with Russia and how it may want to recalibrate how it relates to Russia in terms of security matters and increasing European self-defense.
Do either of you think that is going to be the start of a trend? Is this a one-off removal of military assets by the US in Germany in particular? That will have a short-term or at least an immediate impact on that German-Russian relationship, or are we going to continue to see this sort of trend from the US that will mean that the power balance between Germany and Russia continues to change?
You're always going to see this really fascinating trade-off between Germany and Russia. There is always going to be a demand for Eastern raw materials in Germany. And so that always will, increase Germany's attentions towards the East. And it will always mandate that there will be an economic interest there. But at the same time, their political allegiances and their political, principles are not always compatible. And, history has taught us this. So I think that, the balance of power between Germany and Russia, you'll see it fluctuate over time. But like Ekaterina said before, I don't think that this means that, the relationship itself will dissipate. I don't think that, the Navalny poisoning or even the crisis in Belarus or potential, another clash in Eastern Europe, I don't think that will entirely ruin the German-Russian relationship, because it has stood the test of time despite political crises and despite military skirmishes and war as well. I'll add that as well. I think that Germany is always going to have that economic relationship dictate the balancing act that it has to play between the EU, its Western allies, and of course Russia. But Katerina made a really great point that at the end of the day, Germany, especially because of the leadership position it has in Brussels, it will always in the end align with the EU. But the EU is also fragmented on, its Russia policy and fragmented on, its economic and political policies as well. There isn't consensus entirely on what the EU will do in Belarus. And while there is larger consensus on the Navalny poisoning, and while there is, a movement against the Nord Stream 2 project, there is some fragmentation. So, which does benefit Germany in its balancing act as well. So, but I don't necessarily see this relationship being entirely fragmented from these incidents.
Katerina, did you want to add anything to that?
I absolutely agree with Caroline about that German-Russian relation will not see big changes. First of all, German and Russian relations, they were tested by time. They passed through the wars, they passed from difficult period of time, but anyhow, they continue to be very deeply connected with each other. Russia is the big market for German goods, and Germany is big market for Russian goods. So anyhow, the economic ties will always exist. Also, in general, we have current conflicts like Navalny case and Belarus. In all of this situation, in fact, Germany is not very interested in Navalny itself and in Belarus, since, for example, the political and economic ties between Germany and Belarus have never been so great like with Russia. And the only thing that is really important for Germany is not to have the second Ukraine next to the borders of the European Union. Russia, in any case, with Navalny or without Navalny, with Belarus or without Belarus, will remain an important economic partner. And of course, Berlin doesn't want to spoil the relations because of just Navalny or Belarus revolution. On the other hand, there are countries like Poland and Lithuania that they are waiting some actions from Germany as the main economy and the leader of European Union in order to protect their own, for example, interests. But in any of this situation, I think the German reaction will be the same. They will impose some sanctions, but they will try to avoid much pain to both of the economies, Russia and Germany. And anyhow, I don't think that we need to expect any improvements very soon. Even if the Nord Stream will be completed very soon, or if this case with Navalny will finish, good or bad, the background of their relations is rather negative, and it's really hard to revive it very fast.
Let's come on to Belarus now, which we've kind of glanced at throughout the entire podcast, but let's just dig into it in a bit more detail. Of course, what's going on there at the moment is that the protests are still going on after the election or supposed election of President Lukashenko. And as much as that's faded somewhat from Western news bulletins, it is still going on there. Poland and Lithuania were relatively prominent in their support of the opposition movement. What has Germany's position been, Caroline?
Germany's position has been a lot more careful than many of its Eastern European neighbors. With Belarus, there was an immediate discussion within the European Union of whether to enact sanctions. And inevitably, Germany did get on board. But of course, there was discussion among its European partners, particularly Eastern European countries, for example, like Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, that, if they were to sanction Belarus, especially the government of Lukashenko, that also sanctions should be placed on their Nord Stream 2 project. So Germany was aware of this, and a lot of these allegations increased, especially as the Navalny poisoning came to light. That being said, Germany has been a bit more united on, actions in Belarus and, actions against the Lukashenko government. That being said, they have not been as active as some of its other European partners, say France, with coordinating with the Belarusian opposition. So, like I said earlier, French President Emmanuel Macron, he met with some figures of the Belarusian opposition and gave voice to a lot of their claims and elevated some of their advocacy points. Germany, they recently met with some figures of the opposition, but they were not first. And I think that sequence is notable. France is trying to take the lead in this theater, whereas I think Germany has to be a bit more careful. And if they were the first to do this, I think Russia would have taken, a better note of that, and that would have potentially, threatened some of their economic interests with Russia. So I think that's pretty notable. Germany will condemn and Germany will support sanctions. However, they're not going to be as active with coordinating with opposition sources just because they have this very precarious, fragile economic relationship.
Ekaterina, do you agree? Do you think if Germany had come out stronger on this, that things may be different, or that Russia may have been maybe more cautious?
Yes, I agree with Caroline. At first, Germany didn't believe that the presidential elections in Belarus were democratic, and of course, it didn't recognize the result. Like other countries, Germany condemned the violence against the opposition, and they asked the ruling government and the opposition to the dialogue. There were the meeting between the opposition candidates, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and Merkel. I suppose it was today on the 7th of October. But in fact, I also don't see that Germany is in a hurry to organize the full support to the opposition. There were some attempts from Poland to organize some special fund and so on. But in fact, Germany is very slow in making decisions because, as we mentioned before, Germany has a very awkward choice to make. From the first side, it doesn't want to spoil relations with Poland and Lithuania. From the other side, it doesn't want to spoil relations with Russia. And if they are going to be more tough with their measures and their answer, maybe Russia will also use some negative rhetoric towards Germany, and it may spoil some relations between them. But two countries, they have the understanding. Belarus is mostly, Germany understands Belarus as the country under Russian influence, and it doesn't have so much ties with Belarus compared with Russia, so it prefers to choose Russia to continue to make economic ties and to continue to develop the interaction.
Look, just to finish, let's try and look forward. And I think from what we've said today, I think I know what you're both going to say to this, but let's look forward 10 years. I mean, this relationship has been kind of, like you said earlier, Caroline, both countries walk a tightrope with each other. Do we think that's going to be the same case in 10 years? I'll ask each of you in turn.
Absolutely. I think Germany will continue to walk this tightrope between Europe, the West, and Russia, while trying to maintain close economic ties, ensure that it is accessing Russia's raw materials and energy sources, while that can fuel its industrial industry, while at the same time maintaining its moral and political leadership of the European Union, and keeping its alliance with the United States. And I don't think that this is going to change in the next 10 years. Certainly, there will be some challenges to that relationship, but it has a very deep economic interest to keep this relationship with Russia.
Ekaterina?
I think that the relation between Russia and Germany will continue to develop, though right now Moscow and Berlin do not have major projects except Nord Stream 2. That is very questionable one. They do not have some very intensive interaction. Russia is not longer a threat to the unity of Germany. Also, in addition to this, Russia is losing its share in German oil and gas market, though it continues to be one of the major supplier of goods to the German oil and gas market. But anyhow, all of this, there are some negatives. There are some negative challenges to both of to the relations between Russia and Germany. But anyhow, they will continue to cooperate, and Germany will continue to follow its line and lean towards the European Union, when Russia will try to find its own place and also try to keep its share and position in the European market, but at the same time also will look towards Asian market. So we will have wonderful 10 years of love-hate relations between Russia and Germany, in my opinion.
Well, it's not often that we get such a good consensus when talking about geopolitics, so I thank you both very much for that. Ekaterina Zolotova in Moscow, Caroline Rose in Austin, Texas. Thank you very much for your time today. That's all from us for this episode of the Geopolitical Futures Podcast Plus. From me, Christian Smith in London. Thanks for listening. Go to geopoliticalfutures.com to hear more episodes like this and to find out more about joining our exclusive Club GPF with access to regular live discussions with George Friedman and our team of analysts.